And we are live. How exciting.
Oh, very exciting.
Very exciting. We shall wait a few minutes for people to join us. Stunning. If you are joining, do let us know where you're joining from and watching from. Perhaps some people are watching on LinkedIn. I don't know. And if you want to connect, feel free to leave your LinkedIn in the chat. And just FYI, there is obviously the chat, but also so feel free to kind of ping thoughts and questions in there, and then we will also move those over to the Q&A because we'll have some time for questions at the end. So please feel free to stick those guys in as you are London calling. Very good. As we are going through. But yes, lovely to see everyone here. Give it just another few mins and then we will get going. But I feel like I also, Alex, should have a nice background, like I'm in a fake study, but
this is totally real. Totally real.
Totally real, yeah.
More books than I've ever read in my life.
And just so perfect. That's the thing.
Untouched is the word.
Untouched, yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right, let's crack on because we have a ton of super interesting stuff to get through today. So thank you everyone for joining. You guys are very, very welcome to our webinar speaking about guardrails and particularly LLM-as-a-Judge and how it stacks up for financial services. So let me introduce myself. I'm Ailish. I run the solutions side of things at UnlikelyAI. And I spend a lot of time talking to AI leaders at top tier financial institutions and professional services firms about how they can deploy AI that passes regulation and that they can trust, and building out solutions that can ultimately actually be deployed. And I'm joined by my colleague, Alex Corsham, who I've worked very closely with particularly on the financial services side. So yeah, why don't you introduce yourself, Alex?
Absolutely. Yes. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be talking with you today. So I'm a software engineer at UnlikelyAI, and I've spent around 3 years with Unlikely now, focusing on neurosymbolic methods and really how these can apply to the sort of most complex problems that we've sort of heard are trying to be tackled in sort of financial services, such as guardrailing, which we're going to be talking about a lot today.
Yes, we will hear that word a lot. I think if this wasn't so formal, I would suggest people to drink on every time you hear the word. So yes, we're talking about guardrails here today, and look, I think as a kind of a good setup, you know, we all know the advantages of generative AI at this point. We know it's fluent, it has an incredible ability to decipher meaning from natural language, it's dynamic, but we also know it has flaws, right? As a predictive machine, it makes errors, it struggles with large amounts of context, it's imperfect. And I think in regulated industries, like this creates a real dilemma. How do you get the benefits of using AI, and particularly generative AI, while ensuring you're taking the necessary steps to minimize errors, protect your kind of customers, and stay aligned with regulation? And I think this is where guardrails come in, right? It's essentially a way to check that something is not breaking rules and is staying within some defined set of boundaries. And it's not really specific to AI, actually. I think there are lots of incidences in life where we employ guardrails. One that comes to mind is the various checklists that we employ to ensure procedures have been followed. But obviously today we're going to talk specifically about the financial services industry and the kind of specific challenges of kind of guardrailing AI in that space. So I'm going to start by pulling up a slide here, just to kind of like talk a little bit about the landscape that we're talking about. So from this study or from the Bank of England, I think, yeah, thank you, a bit larger, 75% of firms of kind of financial services firms are using AI, but only less than half of those are kind of, less than half are saying they sort of partially understand it, which is obviously, I think, where a lot of people are with AI these days. And in financial services, like, you're making decisions that are important for people's livelihoods, things related to credit or insurance or kind of how best to use their money. And as a result, the EU AI Act is now kind of classifying these as high risk, which I think makes total sense. But the reality is you have banks that are using AI and not fully understanding it. And then you also have areas where AI would be incredibly helpful in that space, like credit and insurance, being classified as high risk by this incoming legislation. So clearly, it's very important to be able to make sure that you can trust any AI that you do use, and that's typically where the guardrail story starts to become really important. So Alex, love to pull you in here. As someone who obviously is building AI and particularly the guardrails that control it, tell us a little bit about actually what people mean when they talk about guardrailing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this term gets thrown around quite a lot, and I really liked your analogy to sort of like guardrails in the real world, because I think you can also consider sort of where else you see these kind of things in real life, in our day-to-day lives outside of AI. So they are primarily used to sort of protect people from hazards, guardrails on the side of a road or the motorway or something like that, right? Because you can build a road and you can trust people to go along that road, but what happens if they don't? What happens if something goes wrong? It's that what if kind of scenario that is really important to plan for, because people do unpredictable things. And so you then think about, in the world of AI, what safety mechanisms do you need to put around these AI models? Because AI models can also, as I'm sure we've all seen, do unpredictable things. And so there's, really important to consider that they are around the model, because it's not just protecting the output of what your model gives. In a lot of circumstances, you're also protecting what goes into your model. So a really key way to think about that is the very obvious example, probably the most flexible example of where you use something like this, like in a sort of chatbot kind of setup. This is the least constrained way to do this, like a chat GPT-esque scenario, because you're letting people say whatever they want, and supposedly you can talk about whatever you want, and your chat model could say whatever it wants. It's a like absolute nightmare of a problem. So guardrails are like throughout this thing super important. So they're on the input side, so that's making sure your user is not saying things that stray outside the boundaries of what your chat is supposed to be. They're not trying to jailbreak your model and get it to say things it shouldn't. They're on the processing side, so that might be agents tool calls. Can I access the document? Can I write to this document? Those are all guardrails around what your agent can do. And then on the output side, that's very much on, am I allowed to say this thing against whatever regulation you care about? Am I revealing sensitive content? Am I hallucinating? Am I using toxic language? So any good AI system is going to be employing guardrails at every single layer, effectively. And there are all sorts of kinds of guardrails you can employ that we're going to get into later. But I think one thing that is really worth considering is that, big AI labs will say that they do sort of models safety testing. They will entrench guardrails into the training data. And it's worth making sure that that is not a guardrail. You cannot separate it and test it. It's difficult to evidence. So that is something that is put in there to protect you, but you can't rely on it.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's a really important distinction to make. And I guess as this industry, moves so quickly, there's lots of language challenges, because you have the same words being used for things that maybe mean different things, and I think it's really important to keep reiterating that. And I also think that the part about the input, guardrailing input, especially if we talk about chatbots, like I've seen lots of really funny memes of people asking the kind of Amazon chat assistant and other ones to crack some to kind of like do jobs for them or solve some kind of like maths question, etc. And it's funny in those instances, but if you're in financial services, that's actually really scary, because if a user can kind of get your agent to say something that it shouldn't, then it's still said that, and that can cause obviously potential nightmares sort of for the people responsible for this. So really useful to kind of understand the space in which guardrails operate, and specifically in that kind of financial services industry. I guess talking specifically about LLM-as-a-Judge as a guardrail, obviously that's kind of the core topic here of today. We'll talk, love, Alex, for you to tell us a little bit about, how it works, where it's good and maybe where it struggles. But I guess even before that, I think this study was really interesting to kind of pull up and sort of frame that conversation. It was a study published this year that tested kind of 4 of the leading LLM-as-a-Judge models, and found none of them to be particularly reliable across the board. I think one of the really interesting parts of that study was just when it came to something like when it came to the consistency, right? So the study found that these judges were kind of incorrectly changing their answer in response to things like formatting and layout changes, despite the meaning actually being unchanged. And you can see why that would potentially be a huge challenge in financial services. I know, as I said, I've spoken to a lot of people on the ground in kind of top tier institutions across the UK and globally, and they all have huge concerns around consistency, because how do you kind of defend to a regulator a decision if it's changing just because someone added a format change or an extra space or something like that? It becomes super challenging. So I guess, like, Alex, maybe you would talk us through, like, how does LLM-as-a-Judge actually sort of work in the first place?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I like the title of this slide, Under the Hood of LLM-as-a-Judge. In reality, it's actually very straightforward as an idea, right? It's the decision that you're trying to make is just directly in the hands of a model. It's directly in the hands of an LLM. It's like the most trusting of these systems that you could possibly be. And the way you set it up is so straightforward, and I think that's why it becomes the like go-to for a lot of these things. You're setting up a prompt to define whether your decision is met or not. In the case of guardrails, you're saying, is this message or is this policy compliant, or is it a breach? Explain why. It's so straightforward to put together, and that can be great. They're very, very strong pattern matches, and with a little bit of prompt tuning, picking the right model, you can probably get to sort of 90% of what you need incredibly fast. And for very simple cases, that genuinely might be all you need, which is so ideal to reach. But you do really have to consider the effect of the black box here. You really can't peer inside, which, getting under the hood of LLM-as-a-Judge is really tough to do. So nothing actually in the loop is checking that your policy is really being applied as you've enforced it, and your sort of verdict and explanation are coming out in sort of the same tangled path and are very intertwined. Is it a real explanation? It's more of like a post hoc explanation. It's not really telling you what it's thinking as it's going along, and it might read like an audit trail. So for financial services, that's very tempting, but you actually can't reproduce that. And for an audit, that's super, super important. And we found that these to be especially brittle when you actually have a very, very complex policy, that the ones in financial services often are, and it needs to be provided with really, really strict, in a really strict manner, effectively.
Yeah, interesting. One of the words we typically use to describe LLMs is sort of dynamic and fluid, but actually they can become really brittle when you want to get really specific in terms of how they should function and act. I guess, like, just on that, why would a change to kind of like formatting or spacing or anything like that, why would that kind of like trip up LLM-as-a-Judge?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that these models are probabilistic in nature. So maybe the real answer is we don't really know. It's very tough to know. These systems are effectively picking the most likely answer based on the amount of training data that it's seen around this kind of problem, right? And what you might find is that for some very clear-cut problems, that is fine. For problems that are actually quite close to the line, for these sort of edge cases that you'll see, you might be near sort of a 50-50 decision from the LLM anyway. What you might find then is a very, very small tweak to the prompt, to the formatting of the input, could just push it over that boundary, which is a problem in itself. But on top of that, you might find that on successive like identical runs, you then get different answers again. And so you really need to be mindful in your metrics about consistency. Not just, I ran it once, did I get what I want? It's about running it multiple times and really, really digging into those results about, am I getting what I want every time?
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, isn't it? If it is choosing what's kind of most probabilistic, then that, and it is close to the line, then that means that different things will come up different times, and so like understanding I guess the sort of distribution of that is super important. And like, I guess, I mean, you mentioned there that even a sort of small tweak to the prompt itself can totally change the output. Is there something here around, because I think often the answer is like, okay, it's not working as well as it could be, let's fix the prompt. Like, how far can you get with sort of the prompt tuning? And then at what point is it just kind of a fundamental sort of flaw maybe of how it functions?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, as a software engineer in this space, I have spent far longer than I care to admit messing around with prompts, you know, effectively entering into like a pleading kind of cycle with things like, I'm sure if I just change this word, it's definitely going to give me what I want. You know, people remember back in like 2023, you had the like rise of the prompt engineer, these sort of AI psychologists that seemed to know just the right way to structure these prompts to get exactly what you want. And the idea is like, you can certainly tune it for sure. You know, you can adjust the prompt, you can move your metrics, assuming you've got something to measure against other than just sort of like vibes, I suppose. Is it fixable though? I mean, not really in that kind of manner. I guess prompt engineering has kind of dropped off as a discipline, mainly because AI models are much, much smarter and they seem to get tasks. But all the cons around that being a black box and the sort of auditability of these systems still very much exists, even if you tweak your prompt to get the absolute perfect prompt together you could possibly have, right? There's always going to be cases where it falls outside those boundaries.
Yeah, totally. I love that framing as like AI psychologist. It's like just somehow certain people understood what the AI was thinking. Cool. And I guess so. I suppose like last thing, kind of specifically on LLM as a judge, you mentioned in the beginning, lots of people. It's easy to set up, right? Because you basically just prompt it. You just kind of tell it what you want it to do, and try and cover all of the possible bases within the prompt. But is there anything else that any other advantages that it offers?
Yeah, I mean, you've got the main one. I think you've highlighted there is it's like out of the box kind of stuff. You know, I think the appeal is, you know, you want the sort of trust and accountability that sending a decision off to a human would get you. And this looks like the sort of the magic path, right? We'll plug it in. We can write our policy in plain English and just describe what we want. We don't need to train a model. We don't need to label any data. Like, it just works the afternoon you build it and you've got a demo and it looks flashy, right? Unfortunately, you do though still need to be mindful of like other metrics like latency in your systems. You know, these things work in order of seconds, not order of milliseconds of the rest of your code, and that's per check that you actually want to do. And you can now, depending on what you actually want to do and what model you enforce, you're paying per check, and quite a lot as well. And that's per call forever, effectively. They're non-deterministic in nature, and we're straight back to that kind of consistency problem. And unfortunately, in the case of guardrails, they can often fail the wrong way, you know, letting something through and biasing towards, oh, we'll just send it out to a customer, as opposed to let's hold back and be more strategic about how we handle this case. But that being said, yeah, they're absolutely right in the certain kind of circumstances. You sort of highlighted prototyping is such a great example of where these things can live. And I would also highlight that being a voice among several is absolutely a place for these kind of things, because of the flexibility they give. They can be incredibly powerful, but maybe relying on just them as a single check is, not the best approach to go for.
Yeah, 100%. And I know we'll talk a little bit about it in a bit, but the cost thing I think is so interesting, because I remember not that long ago, a year ago or something, there was people floating the idea of just like multiple LLM-as-a-Judge sort of, stacked on top of each other, which obviously there's other challenges with that, but like that then becomes very, very expensive very quickly with the way things are going. Awesome. I think that brings me, oh no, not there yet. I wanted to talk a little bit about what are the other alternatives? I knew there's something missing there. We'll get rid of that. What else can you use? So we've talked about why LLM-as-a-Judge, the pros, some of the cons, but what else can we use?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there's a few different options available now. We're working from the assumption you want to automate some process, right? Because before that, ordinarily you might think about sort of human in the loop. That's still very much relevant, but human checkers would ordinarily be doing and making these kind of decisions that you'd have. And this is sort of the fallback answer, I suppose, in these new way of thinking about these systems. And it does work. It just doesn't scale, and that's why people are looking for other options. It is the best one there to handle sort of genuine ambiguity and accountability, but obviously it's slower. You are having to pay people's salaries rather than automate these things through, and it doesn't really scale well you want. But I think it does still have a place in these systems, not as an entire sort of decisional guardrail, but more like the residual system, I suppose. You need to design for it. Like, what fraction of your decisions do you expect to escalate, and where does that put you in terms of cost, and where does that put you in terms of response time to a customer, and can you absorb that in your system? But that's sort of at the far end of the spectrum. Maybe at the exact other end of the spectrum, you have more deterministic rule-based systems. These are very tempting to reach for as well. They're very cheap. You're writing your rules in code. It's auditable by design and explainable. You can, in the same way that you trust the rest of your system works, that these ones are going to work because you can see the code written out, and it's basically free alongside the rest of your system. Unfortunately, they can be quite brittle. You're never going to cover the kind of cases that like an LLM could handle, for example, because of the flexibility of natural language that we tend to deal in and that we're now used to deal in. And you can very easily go down the rabbit hole of trying to cover every case through these rules. And, that you suddenly realize that becomes very challenging as soon as you switch into like, oh, well, what if we want to handle our system working in French or working in Spanish? And you're like, okay, well, maybe this writing out new rules for every single language is not going to scale the way we thought it would. But again, I think there is still a place for these systems. People often reach straight for an LLM often to handle even like the simplest rule-based tasks, and you want to sort of shake their shoulder and say, you don't need to do that. This doesn't need to cost you anything. For identifying PII in your responses, there are a lot of rule-based systems that will handle that in very cheaply and very fast. And yeah, I suppose sort of where I'm getting to with all these things generally is that you can use them in combination. And a good one that works in combination is the idea of sort of this middle ground, like a sort of either a fine-tuned LLM, a trained classifier, somewhere in the middle. It's effectively a step towards the LLM-as-Judge, but a bit more constrained. The whole idea being it will classify some content you give it, whatever labels you want to get on the output, as long as you have enough labeled data and enough coverage or cases, you can get very, very solid coverage of this, since it is specialized to your particular task, right? And unfortunately, it does require having a lot of that data, which a lot of people seem to have there. So the reason why people often skip through that particular option is because of a lack of data. LLMs can work out the box. The data is in their training data, so you kind of skip through that piece. But there are a lot of interesting options, and I think it's worth being mindful of what else is out there and how they can enhance your system. They are not detriments to your system.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mean, the idea of like kind of overusing LLMs, that definitely popped up for a while when there are like there are simple options that have existed for a long time for certain types of checks. But I think the point around like the sort of human checks, the point you made is really important, right? Like, of course, that's going to be optimal, right? Like particularly for super ambiguous or nuance or like things that require judgment and expertise. But what you don't want to do, because it just becomes completely untenable, is like have it for all of the cases where it's not particularly needed. So it's sort of like, you know, keeping human in the loop, but you've got to be smart about when you kind of leverage that tool, because from a scalability perspective, alongside everything else that you've mentioned. Okay, so I think that sort of brings me to this obvious question: how do you figure out which kind of type of guardrail you actually need? And I guess before we kind of go into that, to add like a little bit of extra flavor to the situation, an important thing to kind of note in this question is that if you are kind of operating within EU regulation, the EU AI, that's such a mouthful to say, EU AI Act is now saying that AI must keep automatic logs of its kind of operations, and not only that, but be able to explain the decision, right? So that obviously impacts any kind of use of AI, and like furthermore, and you mentioned it earlier, Alex, like in every conversation I have with kind of AI leaders in the FS space, like I constantly hear about these trade-offs between things like, as you've mentioned, the risk and the cost, and also the impact on the end user. So that will feed in as well. But I know, Alex, you have come up with a couple of questions that people can sort of ask to try and surface the right information to help inform the guardrail strategy. So love to get you to chat through those.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I bring these up, whoop, there we go. So, I mean, these are the kind of 5 questions I think I'd ask of any system like this, any guardrail, before it goes sort of near a production environment. And the first one that actually is often skipped is, can you demonstrate really reliably that your guardrail does what you expect before you deploy it? You know, the reason that this is often skipped is because of how quick it is to get set up in like this sort of LLM-as-Judge kind of setup. You can skip straight past that, and you try it out. It looks good in a demo, and you're like, super. Run it through a couple of examples that you've thought of yourself, and you're like, let's send this thing on, you know. But actually, you need to take a moment. You need to build up that case, because you need to know if it's good or not. And so that means a really quality evaluation set, and with enough cases for it to actually mean something, in both directions as well, so that you have things that should pass, things that should fail, and the near misses, like everything in between. And that is really going to pay dividends, because the thing you need to ask yourself is, if I change something, if I change a prompt, if I swap a model out, if I add a new rule in my deterministic layer, can you tell straight away whether that improved your system or whether that broke your system? And if you don't have that, you're kind of just entering that vibe territory of these kind of things. The second one is all around, what's the risk of failure? So what happens when something goes wrong? And there's 2 ways to fail in these guardrailing systems, and they're not really of the same size depending on what you do. So one option, sort of like in this sort of like chatbot guardrailing setup, you could overblock, which is one option. So you end up with an annoyed customer. They end up going to a sort of contact center, or you could let a breach through, and that's the one that could end up in front of a regulator and is super, super costly. So you then have a design question. So on ambiguity, which way are you going to fail? Do you fail open or do you fail closed? And that really governs how much you actually build. Is one check enough? Do you want two that could disagree? Is it actually worth automating this at all? Is it going to be more costly in stuff coming from the regulator than it is to actually automate it? Number three is all about budget. You know, these all the things that we've gone through, all those options, they do cost money, and they have different there's different scale of cost associated with them. So you're thinking about sort of what is the actual how much is your system actually getting called upon? You know, in a chatbot, it's every single message. It scales across conversations, number of users, and it's really important to screen everything you need to screen on every single check. So it might be multiple decisions per message. So that scales extremely fast. And one thing that you really need to consider is pricing it at your actual production volume, not just at your demo volume. You know, that is really, really important to work out how it's going to cost when you actually put this thing live, not just, oh, okay, well, this looks like it's fairly cheap for this one conversation I ran. The user is front and center in all this, and this is number 4. So is this actually in your critical path? So, you know, you think about synchronous kind of setups like a live chat, you've got a really, really small budget for this indeed. You know, a user is going to send a message and then be sitting looking at a cursor. You know that needs to come back in a very, very fast amount of time to have a really quality user experience. And consistency matters just as much as the average in these cases. So it's not just about looking at, you know, the mean latency of these things. It's actually your sort of like 95th percentile. What's the tail of these things? Is someone sitting there waiting for 2 minutes for a response, and whereas most people are getting it in under 5 seconds? And that's really, really crucial. And the final one is for regulated industries, probably the most important. How is it going to hold up under audit? And so 3 things it kind of needs to survive. Did it tell you why it failed, or only that it did fail? That's what is covered in that EU AI Act. And is that explanation stable as well? You know, is the same input going to give the same answer, that consistency kind of basis? Is that going to hold up tomorrow, in 1 month, in 1 year even? And, you know, when you do get audited, is that stored? Do you have that available? Can you say why you recommended a product to a customer 3 years down the line if it didn't work out for them? And I suppose if the test there is, if you pull a conversation from 8 months ago, could you defend that verdict effectively? Could you say exactly why you got there, and would you be happy defending that against the regulator?
100%. Thank you for going through all of those. I think it's the trade-offs, right? I think that's the thing that really stands out to me in these conversations, because you can solve for any one of those, but how do you solve for all of them at the same time? Because you know, if we think again back to the sort of chatbot example, it's all well and good having something that's watertight from a compliance perspective, you know, not super expensive, but then is a terrible experience for a user, right? Like, you just won't achieve what you're trying to achieve, which is great customer experience, you know, like more sales, whatever it is that you're trying to achieve, because they'll just go elsewhere. And often elsewhere is a completely impossible comparison, because it is ChatGPT, where they will get for financial advice or whatever it is that they're trying to get. So those things they become really difficult. And I suppose that kind of brings me, I know we're a bit over time here, so hopefully we can move through this a little bit quickly, but kind of brings me to the last key bit, which is like, if we could maybe bring this to light in a real example. And I think also just important to say that obviously at UnlikelyAI, we kind of, our whole mission is around making AI trustworthy, and particularly in sort of regulated spaces. And the kind of core way we do this is by combining the kind of benefits of generative AI and LLMs with more kind of deterministic and symbolic approaches, so that you can have that flexibility, but also the kind of rigor and consistency and explainability that is important, not only for regulators, but also for users, right? Like, no user wants to be getting an incorrect answer or something from a chatbot. So yeah, Alex, love if you could take us through an example.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I'll frame it in an example that we've tackled at Unlikely before. That we've found that clients are having sort of difficulties with in this kind of space. So, if you sort of imagine a sort of retail banking chat application, that you can come to it and you want to find out about the products of a bank, for example. The automated assistant can give you information about these products, but it can't cross into financial advice because that is not something that is possible to do in this kind of scenario. And so that is really, really difficult to do from this kind of perspective. An example being, if it says something like a cash ISA lets you save up to £20,000 a year tax-free, that's fine. That's information. As soon as it says something like you've got 30 grand sitting in your savings, maybe you should put it into a stocks and shares ISA, you're suddenly looking at advice, and like quite a problematic thing as we'll get to. So in terms of going through those 5 checks, one, can you prove it works for a deploy? Let's assume we've got a lot of high quality data to play with here. We've got a lot of the edge cases put in. We've got the happy path, and we can run this really quickly to see how it works. So what's the risk of failure here? So if you let one through, you're basically giving unauthorized advice, like hugely costly. You're looking at remediation, and you're potentially sort of affecting every customer conversation, having to reopen them. But if you overblock and you refuse to answer, the customer is going to be ringing a contact center. It does cost money, but no one's getting harmed in this case. So this is the kind of fail-close system that has to exist. Unlikely, we can bias towards this fail-close system because it's quite hard to do. But the beauty of the sort of neurosymbolic technology is its ability to say we don't know to a question. And this is really powerful because rather than just sort of flip-flopping between 2 options, you have a classification for that ambiguous layer, and you can bias that in whatever direction you want. So in this case, we can bias towards that fail-close system. So if it's going to fit in the budget, we assume we're working on a modest budget here, but we're interested in automation. So obviously, if it costs more than having people facilitate the conversation, then there's definitely a problem. So it runs on every message that your assistant produces. So there's quite a lot of throughput here, and the very complex nitty-gritty policies that sort of govern where that advice guidance boundary exists. For an LLM-as-Judge model alone, you're probably looking at a frontier model, strong possibility of breaking the bank, especially with sort of the prices offered by Claude and stuff like that at the moment. So one question would be, is this actually a non-starter at all? Is this even going to be worth automating given the cost and the risk? And we took a long look at this kind of problem, and Unlikely, this is something that we tackled via putting a lot of that cost up front into building this harness layer around a flexible but constrained LLM-as-Judge system. So we can ingest these policies into basically a symbolic structure that governs how a decision is pieced together. And these small, narrow checks mean that you're not asking sort of the whole decision. Is this message fine? Is this a breach? You instead ask things like, did it name a specific product? Very, very simple cases that you can answer reliably. And that means, because you're shifting a lot of that effort away, you can use much smaller models. So you're not breaking the bank with these kind of full decisions you're getting. And when it comes to where it hits the user, huge benefit there, because you don't actually need the latency cost that comes with these huge models that you would otherwise be using. So these granular checks mean that your sort of wall clock time is very, very small. And finally, when you think about audit, you need to be able to name the rule and what condition made this a recommendation, or crucially, why this message wasn't a recommendation, because you don't know exactly what problems you're going to face down the line in an audit. So you need to be able to justify both. And so, we find that the ability to evidence the actual stored verbatim response from a customer is super, super important, not just sort of a summary of what they said, alongside our sort of neurosymbolic structure that provides a persisted, auditable explanation instead of just kind of what the model proposed. So, I mean, having been through those, hopefully gives a bit of a flavor of how you might consider those checks in your own systems, and a bit of a peek as well into how we tackle those in our own systems using neurosymbolic technology at Unlikely.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that. And I know it's been we spend a lot of time figuring out the kind of optimal way to construct these, the sort of guardrailing side of things in a way that gives that flexibility, but balances all of those kind of core trade-offs to kind of optimize, or allows you that, or like the kind of user to balance those trade-offs in a way that kind of optimizes for the business, and I think that's super important. I'm gonna throw us over to the Q&A for the last few minutes. I guess just before I do that, we've built a guardrailing tool at UnlikelyAI, kind of using all of those, all of the things that we've discussed today, and optimizing for configuration to maximize on those trade-offs. So if you are keen to find out more, please do drop us a message. I believe there may be a CTA at some point. There you go. So please connect and we can tell you a little bit more about that. So we've had a bunch of really interesting questions. I'll jump straight in with this one, which is going to flash across the screen. Stunning. So how do you keep guardrails working over time as the model and the rules keep changing? This comes in from Maria.
Yeah, this is a great question. So I mean, in terms of keeping them working over time, I think, we have all seen models getting deprecated, new models coming in. It's often quite overwhelming, being like, oh my, what should we be using right now? I think one important way you can keep them working over time is keeping your system as sort of model agnostic as possible, keeping it flexible. And if you have that way to say whether your guardrail is working or not working, you put a real metric to it, that gives you the flexibility to mess around with those kind of things. You then have options in terms of like open source models, where you can host them yourselves and you can make it incredibly cheap. You're not then tied into, the whim of whatever Google wants to do with their model deprecation process. There's a lot of ways you can keep them flexible over time that will really help you out in the long run.
And I think, I guess, like the important thing to kind of bear in mind with that question is that I think is more difficult if you are relying on prompts, right? And especially if you've spent a lot of time tuning the prompt to try and make it just right, and then a model change, perhaps that totally changes how that prompt interacts. And so, just I think the model agnosticism is really actually quite crucial, given there is a new model every single week. And so things are changing very quickly. I'm gonna jump to this question, which I think we more or less covered in terms of the framework, Alex, that you went through. But what I thought was really interesting, this comes in from Adam, about this question is, this answer of like, where do you start with this, right? And I think that probably depends, but love, Alex, to hear your thoughts on whether you are already set up with a kind of more mature system or kind of architecture, and you have some guardrailing tools and you're thinking about assessing the ones you have versus starting out or thinking about a new guardrail or a new system. But keen to get your thoughts.
Yeah, so I guess in terms of considering what you actually need to guard in your system, I think a good way of thinking about that is around that concept of risk. It's sort of the asking about like what if kind of problem. In traditional software, your what if is like, what if my service goes down and my app breaks kind of thing. But with AI models, it becomes much more complex. It's sort of what if this is something completely different to what I'd expect. And that doesn't just apply in the sort of flexible chatbot case, that really applies everywhere. It's making sure you're guarding against what it could possibly do rather than like the happy path. I'd say it's, you assume you're going to get the happy path in most cases, but it's what if something else comes along from that response effectively.
Yeah, it's the edge case, isn't it? And the things that you perhaps don't necessarily assume but need to consider up front. Yeah, absolutely. I think we're at time, so I think we'll call it there. But thank you guys for joining. This has been really fun. I mean, me and Alex get to talk about this stuff on the regular, but it's quite nice to carve out some specific time to dig into it.
For an organised natter.
Yeah, an organised yap. And hopefully has been useful and helpful for all of you guys listening and watching. If you do have questions that we didn't get to, or anything else that you want to cover, please do feel free to ping them over on LinkedIn, or I'm sure there'll be a follow-up email as well, and we will get back to you. And as I said, if you do want to hear a bit more about what we're doing at Unlikely, please also get in touch. But thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Alex, as always, and see you guys on the next one.
Thank you.